or vision 7. And just by the slip of the tongue there, we can see that we need to start with symbols and vision, the interface. The interface between symbols and vision is a transcendental membrane, so that it's not available for inspection. All that we can do to determine is either a projective imagination, which is an integral way of trying to visualize that transition, or we can do a mnemonic retrospective, which is a differential way of trying to achieve similar results. The interface itself is invisible and does not occur in any way that could be phenomenally determined. That is to say, when one comes to the center of the mind, one drops out of the mind. I'm reminded of Dante's Divine Comedy, where the Inferno is a series of concentric circles that come closer and closer to the center, and at the very center sits the devil. But at the very center of the devil is an axis of openness which goes in the mouth and comes out through the other end of the alimentary canal. And the only way out of hell is to go through that. Dante, being a little more elegant than me, has the exit to the Inferno at the center of hell, and he doesn't pose the obvious, more gruesome details of the alimentary canal. It's an ancient yogic technique. The wheel of existence keeps its shape by spokes, and the certainty of the rim of the wheel of existence is confirmed by the certainty of the spokes, but the spokes do not meet at the center. They meet at a hub, but at the center of the hub is an openness. It's the only way that an axle could engage the wheel. So that something axial, like an axis, does not participate in the wheel structure at all. It cannot. It would be co-opted into the wheel. So that the whole image of the cycle of mythology, the circle of ritual, the cycles of nature, the wheel of existence, the whole wheel of fortune, the entire wheel motif has an openness at its center, and it is surrounded and defined by the image of the hub, which holds one end of the spokes, which are held at the other end by the rim of the wheel. There's no way that the wheel is the totality. It's simply the total form of the cycle. And obviously, the form of the wheel does not exhaust what we would call real. So all of the human images, no matter what area of the world they come out of, the wheel of existence is always supervented by context, generally around the edges of the wheel. In a Tibetan mandala, the wheel of life, which you've probably all seen examples of. The wheel of life is held by a little demon. Its puffy, cute little claws hold it at the top, and its little puffy monster face is over the top. The problem is to get off the wheel, and as long as one is co-opted into the dynamic, the motion of the circle, of the cycle, you are a part of the wheel and cannot exit. And it's very difficult to get off the rim of the wheel. Usually the only way off the rim of the wheel is through death. So as one approaches, in our example here, the Tibetan wheel of life, as one approaches the rim, one finds more ghostly images. The hungry ghost realm, the preta, inhabit the rim, or just under the rim itself being very solid barrier, resistance. And only by death can we exit off the rim of the wheel of existence. Can we go off the wheel of circumstance this way? But we would like to be able to know how to exit the wheel of circumstance without having to die. The only other possibility is to go through the center. So the whole motif of centering, of being able to come to that center, and the center point of the wheel is at rest. While the wheel is constantly spinning when in use, and the spokes are spinning, and even the hub is a part of the spin, the interior space of the hub does not spin unless there's an axle that's connected to the wheel that fills that space in such a way that the axle then turns with the wheel. But the image base is that of the wheel of existence, not of the axle in the wheel of existence. Another way of saying this is that the world spins on its axis. And the world is like a wheel of fortune, constantly going round. And life is caught up in this. And one can't escape from this. The gravity of the dynamic is too much. The co-optive illusion of the imagery is too much. We cannot leave except by death. Or by coming to the still point of the earth, which would be the magnetic axial pull. All of this kind of language depends upon imagery in order to express itself, but memory in order to organize and restructure the experience that comes from the imagery into something which we can use to help us in our experience beyond the limitations which nature gives to us. We've been using The Art of Memory by Francis Yates and Hildegard of Bingen's visionary writings as a pair. We've been talking about the art of memory. I would like to bring in another aspect. This is a recent book by another woman, Mary Carruthers, The Book of Memory, a study of memory in medieval culture. She brings out a very interesting observation that in Chaucer's day, in Middle English, a word which was used for an object that was the center of memory was male, M-A-L-E, male, like the male sex. The modern English spelling of the term is male, M-A-I-L, male. like post office, mail. She writes, the Middle English word mail, modern English mail, is a traveling bag or pack of leather, for leather makers constructed them. The immediate origin of the word is French. It's not Latin derived at all, and probably comes because its cognates suggest some Germanic origin. One could carry various items in a mail. One also carried valuables, especially gold. Chaucer's partner carries his relics in his mail. It has internal compartments for ease of sorting, especially changing money. When Chaucer uses the English word figuratively in the Canterbury Tales, it is such a mail as I have been describing, so writes Mary Carruthers, a leather strong box bound with a buckle that he has in mind, rather than a peddler's pack, which Walter Skeat and every subsequent annotator gives as a gloss on this word. Walter Skeat did a 7-volume set of Chaucer text and criticism, which was the standard for many generations around the turn of the century. Metaphor becomes an English version, indeed the very first recorded, of the speaker-composer opening the organized compartments of his memory to disclose its store of riches. Chaucer's metaphor seems to have been immediately and widely imitated. In other words, this leather pouch that has internal compartments for sorting out, especially to organize money so that one can make change, keep track of what you have, and carry other valuables, other items in, which was an essential item to have, especially if you are a conscientious person on a pilgrimage, that this became the metaphor for the whole functioning of memory. Now, this is a whole different aspect, a different tradition from the one that Francis Yates brings out, and we'll see that the two have a paired quality. You've been reading about one half of a pair, here's the other half of a pair. So we're using two women to show the two halves of a pair of techniques of memory, and how they're related, and why the whole complementation of them was the high point of the Renaissance. Let's follow Mary Carruthers for just a moment further. She's talking about how Chaucer's Middle English, for the first time, focuses and makes available this word mail, which then became our mail, which has something to do with the leather pouch. It's almost like the mailman today has the leather pouch, and he carries all of the letters, and they're addressed to you at your various addresses, and he knows how to deliver them because he knows where you live. And he can take these letters that come in from disparate people, and they're sorted, and the mail is deliverable because you have addresses, street numbers, and streets that are arranged. In other words, it is an example of memory, of how a certain quality, a certain class, a certain technique of memory works. Follow Mary Carruthers, just another paragraph I'm excerpting so that you get a condensation of what she's saying. But it is to a Mr. Stephen Hawes, who most evidently understood this image of Chaucer's as I am suggesting it should be, in a book of his entitled The Pastime of Pleasure, published in 1517. Dame Rhetoric, who's a protagonist in this book from 1517, Dame Rhetoric, whose wise advice the narrator has carefully marked in memory, that is, tagged, labeled, as well as stored, put away in order, gives instruction on an invention, the way in which composition can take place. Interesting for being among the earliest presentations in English of mnemonic teaching. One thinks for just a second, what's going on in England in 1517? In 1517, the Italian Renaissance, as centered around Ficino and Pico, the Platonic Academy in Florence, is having a tremendous impress in London, in England. Largely, firstly, because of John Colet, who was the Dean of St. Paul's of the day, who went to study with Ficino for a little while, who was a correspondent with Ficino, and whose prize student was Sir Thomas More, the man who turned out to be St. Thomas More, Sir Thomas More, who wrote Utopia, among many other works. And their friend in common was Erasmus of Rotterdam, who made the first edition of the Greek New Testament since ancient times, since classical times. He's the one, Erasmus, restored the text of the New Testament in accurate Greek so that one could hold up Erasmus's New Testament and see that the translations that had been made of the New Testament in all the languages of Europe were deeply flawed because they'd been based on texts that were completely amended, changed, editorialized through those long centuries. And that none of the priests, none of the monks, none of the bishops, none of the popes knew their New Testament at all. They didn't have a trustworthy text. They were using flawed books. Erasmus, a real revolutionary. It's good for the church that he wasn't a forceful personality. It would have ended the Middle Ages right there. Colet, Sir Thomas More, Erasmus, Ficino, Pico, all of these individuals shared this tremendous renaissance that started, really took hold in the early 1440s, but came firmly into place around 1453, when Ficino finished the translation of the Hermetic treatises, the little book that had been, a series of books that had been brought from the fall of the Byzantine Empire, just as Constantinople was falling to Mahmet the Conqueror, which was around the early 1452-53. Just as the city was falling, the translation of the Hermetic manuscripts came out in Florence. And Florence came in to displace Constantinople, Byzantium, exactly at the same time in history. Exactly at that time was the very first version in a public way of the tarot cards. In another city republic, very much like Florence, in Milano, the Visconti Sforza family. A marriage had taken place in the family, and Isabella d'Este had decided that she wanted to have some things, Bianca Sforza, and the whole family decided finally to have a series of material presented for them with their family crest now of the three intertwined circles, And one of the very nicest presentations of this by a librarian at the New York Public Library, the tarot cards painted by Bembo for the Visconti Sforza family, Gertrude Moakley. The New York Public Library published this in 1976. It's interesting that just at the same time that the Hermetic treatises came out in Florence, the tarot cards were made public in Milano. The development in England of the way in which the crown, the royal quality of English understanding was beginning to have the seeds of a non-medieval look at the world. It was the preparation for the House of Tudor, Henry VIII, who would come very soon after. All of this coming to a conclusion, coming to some kind of fruition about 2-3 generations later. By 1517, when this little volume, The Pastime of Pleasure, came out with the memory system, with the leather pouch, with Chaucer's reintroduction back into the world of this most ancient and most primordial of all instruments. You have to understand that Chaucer was a sophisticated international traveler. He dealt with purchasing items like wool or wine in places like France and Italy for the king. And so he was at home. He was an international traveler. And being so, Chaucer busied himself with little hobbies, and one of his hobbies was beautiful instruments. He had a special astrolabe that was made for him. He had one of these mail pouches. He had all kinds of items, all kinds of inventions. And wherever he went, he would read his works out loud to the courts. And he became one of these individuals who Chaucer was largely viable in the 1370s, 1380s, on into the 1390s. So he's like a precursor of the Renaissance in a way. He's the English tie to France and Italy. And so the Italy of Petrarch, the Italy of Boccaccio, comes into England at that time, integrated. The France of some of the early academies seeking to break away from the medieval scholastic way, sometimes centering around in the city of Paris, the Saint Victor community, the Victorines, Hugh and Richard of St. Victor and their successors. Chaucer was an integrator of all of this. And when one looks for a very early wise man, a magus of civilization, one doesn't look for some occult figure who nobody ever heard of. When one looks to find who made the next step in civilization, one finds someone as hidden because they're so well known as Geoffrey Chaucer. He's one of the great geniuses of world history. His art of memory, his mail pouch, his way of organizing the mind's differential capacity is all arranged around a technique that goes back to the most ancient of all origins of writing. Another woman who has done the ultimate research on this published a volume, Before Writing, From Counting to Cuneiform, University of Texas Press, about 1989, Denise Schmant-Besserat. We've talked about her book last year. We talked about the way in which the origins of writing, the origins of literacy, go back to something that was a stage before literacy, and the stage before that was numeracy. Human beings, in terms of written symbols, are numerically capable long before they're literately capable. We learn to write numbers long before we learn to write words. Not in terms of dozens of years or hundreds of years, but in terms of thousands of years. Numeracy was a written capacity for human beings for many thousands of years, about 5,000 years before literacy became viable to the extent that one could begin to use it. The earliest numerical techniques were to make these little tokens, which were like the gradations of money, like the sizes of coin. Only instead of gradations of money, there were gradations of product. Certain little tokens would stand for different kinds of product. So many jugs of oil, and there would be a token for a jug of oil. So many sheep, there would be a token for a sheep, etc. These tokens were collected together and kept in little clay pouches, like little pita bread pouches. And eventually, these pouches recorded on the outside, on the cover, in two-dimensional design, a summation of how many of this token were inside, how many of this token were inside. And so there was a list, a two-dimensional list of the three-dimensional tokens inside of the mail pouch. Oh, excuse me, I'm getting ahead of myself. Inside of the little clay pita bag. In other words, memory and number were integrally tied together from the beginning, so that memory has a numeracy structure to it. And when literacy came, literacy growed out of it. Was an unfoldment of the numerical mnemonic structure. So that some 8,000 years after the beginnings of numerical grouping, making of sets of significant, signifying emblems to express quantification, which one could then trust was accurate. When you came to someone like Pythagoras, he was the one who developed philosophically the realization that out of arithmetic comes geometry. That out of number comes literacy, and that the two are connected together in the way in which memory functions. In fact, one of the little sayings of Pythagoras is geometry is history, which puzzles modern philosophers because, excuse me, they don't learn to think for themselves. Learning to think for yourself is a very time-consuming process. It takes a long time. This education helps because it truncates a whole lifetime of searching into just a 2-year cycle. But that 2-year cycle is deceptively easy. If you really do this education, it's a 2-year torrential roller coaster ride. Because there are many tens of thousands of years of evolution packed and folded into this. So one could do this really a couple of times at least and find great interest in it. Let's come back to a point that we don't want to lose sight of. The point is that the way in which memory developed in actual human experience, actual human history, had at its very origin a paired procedure. One procedure was to keep track numerically of these kinds of tokens and to record them in a pouch. Chaucer rediscovered the mail pouch, as a mnemonic tool in his time, because he was like a Renaissance individual, a pre-Renaissance individual, trying to bring back into play for himself something which was essential. I would imagine out of his own experience, because when he would read his writings to the elegant lords and ladies of the courts of France and Italy as well as England, it's a little boring to watch somebody just read, so Chaucer probably mastered the art of memorizing the pages and declaimed them. And it's very difficult to declaim something that's written, as fine as Chaucer is written, from just declaiming spontaneously. If I had to write these lectures out, I would write them with such detailed filigree that it would be very difficult for me to memorize them. Why? Memory needs to have a play. It needs to have literally a dramatic context within which it is able to function. It needs some leeway. Chaucer's art of memory leads because it's used in someone who's used to traveling, someone who's used to a pilgrimage. Chaucer's book, The Canterbury Pilgrims, about a collection of people who travel, who go to a destination. That kind of memory registers itself ultimately not just in a token bag, not just in the mail of a money pouch, but registers itself in a book. The book is the ultimate purse for carrying what a memory will use in that tradition. The other tradition, the one Francis Yates is talking about, that art of memory, does not register itself in a book, but registers itself in a theater, in a place. That theater originally is a temple. The theater is an English secular version of the archetypal temple. It's the arrangement of the architecture of the temple that is the place where one remembers what is real. And all of the drama that happens, the dramatic initiatory sequence that's necessary for participating in and understanding and discerning the real, takes place there. The very floor of the Gothic cathedral had within itself a series of dramatic episodes that were performed again and again. And in this beautiful little volume by C.F. Tucker Brooke of about 90 years ago, he shows the floor plan of a cathedral with its 22 stations. 22 archetypal stations that fit the cycle of the major arcana very well. The book is called Tudor Drama. It's not called Esoteric Studies. It's not called Metaphysics. And Tucker Brooke was a very famous Shakespearean scholar, well known, still read. Not only that, not only is there a pairing between the book and the theater. In fact, one of the beautiful little studies of Shakespeare that came out quite recently, Robert S. Knapp, Shakespeare, the theater and the book. Because Shakespeare, while he forms himself around the theater. Shakespeare's Memnonic lineage runs from the temple, from the church, from the cathedral to the playhouse. The world playhouse. His theater was called the Globe. It's the whole sphere of the world. It's the entire world. All the world's a stage. His very lines, his very intent. Shakespeare was never himself interested in putting his plays out as books. They were of interest to him as dramatic performances in the theater. The theater was the place, the locus. It was only after his death that his works were collected into a book for the first time by his friends, Ben Jonson and friends. The first folio of Shakespeare in 1623 is, about 9 years after his death? 7 years after his death, 1616. And one finds in the first folio of Shakespeare, as Ben Jonson says in the very introduction, he says, "Reader, you may find herein more wit than you have brain to grind it upon." Because the man hasn't just sat down to write a book for you. This is a cosmic cycle of somebody who was so accomplished, but accomplished not in the tradition of the mind registering in a book, but in the tradition of the mind registering in the theater. He was a secular priest of the most high order of religion, the play of reality. And the only kind of confirmation that such a person has is whether the people pack the playhouse or not. For Shakespeare, it was the audience that confirmed whether he was writing well or not. In Elizabethan times, if the playhouse was silent with politeness, your play was a failure. Shakespeare was happy when the Globe was humming with activity. Like the white sound patois that one experiences on the radio of baseball games. There's this comforting murmur in the background that the crowd's alive. They're ready to throw vegetables, they're ready to throw kisses, but they're ready to throw, and that's what's important. To sit politely and silently was death. It's terrible for a dramatic performer to have a dead audience. One likes to have that scintillating, nervous energy, which means that they're with you. And it's then that dramatic action has its energy. And the playhouse confirms then that this energy has a dynamic form within which to play itself out. So that the play is not a book in the theater. The play is the focus of the playhouse. Even the term playhouse is where the play happens, where the play is at home. The theater. Shakespeare's theater does not come out of the same Memnonic tradition that Chaucer and his Canterbury Tales comes out of. Chaucer comes out of a tradition of traveling. Shakespeare comes out of a tradition of the medieval theater. If there was a traveling, it was a traveling in miniature of carrying the stage from place to place, like in the miracle plays or the mystery play cycle, like the Wakefield mystery plays or the Chester mystery plays or the Townley miracle plays. The Huntington Museum has the original edition of the Townley plays. It's one of the best there is in the world. And one can go there, and if you have 18 recommendations, they'll let you peek at it. It's a unique manuscript. It's very difficult to find. All of this, the Townley manuscript, is written in a 15th century hand, which comes from the time of the Renaissance. When one had these plays, these miracle plays, these mystery plays, they were popular renditions from the Bible, from the Old Testament, from the Pentateuch, from the Torah, from the New Testament, from the Passion story of Jesus. They were these kinds of plays, and they were put on by guild people. They, for some reason, the leather tanners always got together as a guild, and they played the little drama of Lucifer. And various other guilds would play various other little miracle plays, and there would be a cycle of this. But the cycle would start with a pageant of all of the carts for each of the plays coming into town. And that pageantry is very similar to the pageantry of the painted caravan. The painted caravan, here a book, Penetration into the Secrets of the Tarot Cards. That the major arcana of the tarot cards are themselves cars. They are cars that made a string, a procession that would come into your mind. These cards were the caravan of vehicles, the gypsy wagons of secret lore that would then come into your mind, and when they would be put into their cycle of dramatic participation, the mind would become the theater, wherein the symbols would play, wherein the images would be the costuming, and one would then have for oneself the experience of remembering that you knew these things before. That what was startling in this play was not that you learned something new for the first time, but that for the first time you remembered something old. That you recognized something that was familiar to you and you didn't know. Something that came out of a realm which was subconscious to the life which you were living. And in medieval times, anything differential was subconscious. There was no vision. Visions were for saints and mystics. There was nature, there was ritual, there were the myths, and if you were really sophisticated, there were a few symbols. That was the extent of the range of your life. But these kinds of pageant cars of the dramas, of the testaments of God's Word, or these images of the pageant cards of some deep ancient learning, when they would come in to the arena for the mystery plays was circular and had 8 special stations. Here in the Wakefield mystery play cycles, they give it. The 8 spokes of the wheel of fortune, the wheel of the world. The whole pattern of all of these things works together, aligns themselves together. The mind has a structure that's very similar to the totality of the world. And the world and the mind aligned together seem to show that the whole cosmos has some kind of a wheel structure to it. So that the world somehow in its wheel is midway between the wheel of the mind's structure, largely subconscious, but can be teased out into play, or teased out by play into manifestation, what we would call today in mathematics as a manifold. And that the cosmos is a paired manifold to the mind. And only when the world is arranged in a kind of rationed order of completeness do we recognize an affinity between our mind and the cosmos. That our pattern is the very pattern that we see in the starry expanse. But that similarity, that symmetry, that pairedness only occurs when we've explored the mind enough to get its fullness in total, and explored the cosmos enough to get its pattern in toto. It's only by completenesses that we're able to see, and it's only then that the mediating prism of the ordered world, of the rational frame of this life in all of its vicissitudes, is an accurate confirmation. It becomes then, instead of a wheel which imprisons us, it becomes a lens which allows us to see affinity. When the theater is complete, not just presenting a play, but a whole cycle of plays that together constitute the prism of the real, that audience has a rare chance then to participate in seeing the cosmos as a whole. It seems rare that one would find dramas arranged in such a cycle, but once one gets it, one sees that it's there. Wagner's Ring Cycle at Bayreuth. Aeschylus or Sophocles or Euripides' cycle of tragedies, not just the three tragedies, but the satyr play that made the fourth. And one too can learn to understand that Shakespeare writes in such a way that the plays can be presented in cycles of four. When you take the cycles of four together, Shakespeare's plays begin to be a prism of the entire cosmos. They open up the Renaissance capacities of a mind. To reduce Shakespeare down to a single play is the purview of the academic, the literary critic, and the parlor reader. But someone who lives on the wild edges of an ocean, of a cosmos that's quite formidable, one has to take whole cycles of his plays. Let's come back after the break, and we'll take a look at some other examples of the way in which memory ordered itself. One other example I'd like to bring out is the Sefer Yetzirah, because the Zohar, the Book of Splendor, is a first century of the Common Era patterning of number and image together into cosmos. And again, another cycle. Let's come back. Two different qualities, two different processes, two different focuses. One focus becomes an architecture. The other focus becomes a book. So that the memory functioning has a pair of ways in which it is operative, just as a little mnemonic truncation, Chaucer and Shakespeare. There are many other examples that one can use. Probably the most basic way to look at it is within the developing context that we've been using now for at least half a year here. When we look at Paleolithic men and women, When we look at their cave temples, their ancient Ice Age cathedrals, and we see that places like Lascaux or Altamira or dozens of other examples, that these were not places of unknowing, but they were locales of knowing. They were penetrations into the earth for purposes of understanding something larger than the earth. They were potentially tombs that became wombs that rebirthed the men and women who were initiated there. And so a Paleolithic architecture, like the cave temples, shows itself again and again. When we come to the development of symbolic civilization, some 3000 BC, for an example, the Great Pyramids. The Great Pyramids make within themselves cave temples again. The Queen's Chamber, the King's Chamber, the place of the sarcophagus. These again are caves in man-made structures. The pyramid becomes a prism of the organized world. The whole world becomes organized into a prismatic structure. We're used to seeing pyramids in the ruined condition. When they were finished, they were covered with a reflecting surface. And when you're in something like the Qattara Depression out in the Sahara Desert, you can get a mirage of the Nile Valley pyramids floating in the midst of the desert air. Positioned so that if you were some archaic divinatory group at Siwa Oasis, one could be there on the edge of the Qattara Depression and see the mirage of the pyramids for oneself when they were glowing reflective prisms. The modern world that we inhabit is largely a junkyard of ruins of very sophisticated origins. At the very center of what is today the Gobi Desert was a fantastic civilization, mythologized as the Shambhala of the Theosophists. Very viable, extremely potent. A meeting of all the great religions of the world. And what our education seeks to do is to refresh and bring these instances back into play, but also bring a current, a contemporary, a looking towards the future version, which is the education itself, into viability. And what we're exploring now in vision is the way in which vision as a whole, as a process, is a transformational medium. It's a kind of electrolyte solution out of which another objectivity can come into manifold focus. And that new object is the person. The person. And the person gels, precipitates out of the transformational medium of vision and nowhere else. Persons do not form out of nature. Persons are differential, conscious forms, and they're not at all existent. They're not like extant forms, like existence itself. There's quite a different quality to the person. And to confuse one's person, one's personality, with one's existence is a confusion that projects itself in a regressive way with a preoccupation over identity. And identity is a fool's game. The search for identity is a mock process that is never realizable except in an abstract way. And to achieve an objective abstraction such as one's identity does a great disservice not only to your existence, but to your person. Both suffer. And in order to ensure the achievement of an abstract objective identity, the only context in which that can occur is in terms of a doctrinaire ideology. And so identities are figments of the designs of ideological doctrines. There's absolute despicable emphasis. Has ruined lives of billions of men and women. Is nonsense for which those who are conscientious about the new form of civilization are simply drawing a line and saying no further. Don't bring your baggage and your trash any further. It stops here. And it's not that arguments can be arrayed to promote a pro and con vis-a-vis this point. But the entire context of maturation dissolves that so that there's not even a problem. It's not a question of arguing pro and con on an issue. The issue dissolves. It's not even there. It's not a real concern. It's an artifact of abstract truncation. An identity is, to use a current Shakespearean scholar's term, it's an artificial person. When we look at these kinds of large structures like this education, it's like doing an end run around problems that seem to be intractable and actually are experienced to be irrelevant fixed fortresses for ideologies that are made up. They're programmatic props for isms and their dramas. We don't even have to play with those games. Those are vicious toys that have nothing to do with childhood, but are symptomatic of madness. And we don't need to engage with them at all. But to not engage with them means learning to see it with better eyes. Learning to experience with wider capacities. We've seen that a square of attention is about all that one can hold as a frame of reference. And that one of the discoveries of this form of education, of presenting this way that education, in a wisdom sense, traditionally happened, is to give it its DNA structure. So that one can keep track, one can constantly, like a navigational instrument, keep track of where one is vis-a-vis any kind of situation that arises. And as vision is brought into play, nature as a phase which one has counted on all the time and is incorporated from the very beginning of one's development, for the very first time, needs to be let go, to subside, to become, as perhaps the best term that we have, to become subconscious. As one becomes capable at envisioning for oneself possibilities, one has to let go of the exigencies of nature in terms of the frame of reference, the square of attention. It's not that nature is effaced at all, it just is let to be what it is, and one's attention goes to ritual and myth and symbol and vision. But as soon as vision begins to mature, and that next phase, that objectivity of the person comes into play, a phase which we will see is art. As art comes into play, ritual goes out, becomes subconscious. It goes out of the frame of reference, goes out of the square of attention. And so when art is a functioning part of your square of attention, existence or ritual comportment, the objectivity that embodies becomes somewhat subconscious. And it's a balancing act because art and ritual, because they work like inverse proportions, one sometimes has to do a balancing act. When one is a dancer, and it's important to use the body in its ritual comportment for the dance, one has to not go too far into art, but balance art and ritual so that the square of attention is somewhat distributed, so that the development of the fourth side to that square art isn't taken too far into it, so that the side of ritual is balanced, so that one doesn't have just one or the other, but there is a modulation. It's like an inverse proportioning. And one can learn to do this. But what is not learnable in any method of education on the planet today is what happens next. Because the next phase after art is history. And history, again, is a process. It alternates by syncopation. You have a phase of process and a phase of objectivity. And when history comes into play, what is in inverse to it is myth. And as myth goes out of play, it carries with it, when myth becomes subconscious, it carries with it all of the accoutrements that are there with it. Experience, language, tribal relationalities, culture. The more that history comes into play, the less viable cultural tradition is. The less one can count on one's experience. The less one can count on one's language to be just naturally viable. One has to begin to learn, as a philosopher, Stanley Cavell, said, one has to learn to mean what one says. You can't just wing it anymore. And so history becomes extremely precarious, because the more that it enters into our frame of reference, the less that the whole realm of mythic language and experience and cultural tradition is countable. It's there, but it's not something we can count. It's not in our square of attention. And history has been a problem for the last 2,400 years, but never so much as in the 20th century. And historical wars have just about ruined this century. And we can see prescriptively, we can see projectively, that the next round of warfare is terminal. It's not only not nice, it's not redoable. Because the very foundations of life will be effaced from operative viability. Not just nuclear winter, there are much even more terrifying aspects from that. And so we're trying to buck against a situation that has become so horrific that we don't want to go further, and yet part of the dynamic of evolution is that if you don't evolve, you devolve. And a devolution now, which has been happening for the last 30 years, has to find some kind of objective place where it can maintain stability. In a human being, the stability is usually to come back to the body, to come back to ritual, to count on something ritualistic, to follow some ritual pattern. Like when the sun goes down, you ring the bells, and everybody puts on the old rough brown cowls and files off to prayer. We're all going to be able to be okay. We're all going to be able to eat if we do this. Or if we burn 7 candles that are out of pure beeswax that are made on the full moon, then these quiet flames are going to ensure that we're going to be able to be okay, we're going to be safe. Or we're going to go to church on Sunday, or we're going to go to synagogue on Saturday. Or we're going to kill the infidels on Friday. There are all kinds of ritual comportments that make you feel good because these are the good old days. The bad get what's coming to them, and the good get to give it. But these regressive qualities that are pernicious for the individual are madness for civilizations. Because when civilizations regress back, the body of civilizations that are workable are the way that they were workable thousands of years ago when they were new. And part of the problem is that symbolic civilizations were never workable when they were new. One can't regress back to the ancient Greeks. It didn't work then. So where do you go? You go back to the origins of Neolithic civilizations, but they didn't work then either. They were a problem. The last civilizations that were stable were the Paleolithic. And so you get the future heroes who look like cavemen. You get Conan the Barbarian, who's nice, stable, safe, and secure if you're on his side. If you're not, you better take out insurance. So there's a peculiarity. The 21st century has a double quality to it. It can either be the future that develops out of some maturity and fullness, or it can very quickly devolve, takes about 2 generations, about 40 years. Can devolve back to where it's lightsabers again to hack each other. Or one can have light sabering as a vision of a new cosmos. You can have this regressive, dramatic ritual of good guys and bad guys using lased light to make little swords that were good in Neolithic times, or you can use lasers to be some kind of a metaphor for the way in which organized seeing by some matured person is able to envision possibilities which are new. The regressions are so tempting because they're delectable, they're tasty, they're mythological. But they're completely irrelevant. They don't have anything to do with the unfolding real, with the possibility of maturity. And it doesn't matter how many hundreds of millions of dollars are made by people queuing up to get admission to these things. It's a fool's paradise. There is a completely new cosmos, never before seen because it never before was inhabited, because we now coming into our maturity change the mix of the universe so that it is that new cosmos. It will be whatever it will be, whatever our creative participation with it elicits out. We're the protagonists that the universe is waiting for to enter into something new. And its objectivity is scientific. It will be very actual, mathematically actual, personally living. But to the extent that one still has a mythic taste, a habit of having a diet, of having mythic experience arbitrate what one is going to do, the historical process is not going to work. It just simply won't work. And it's not that history is bad, but that the historical process fails. It doesn't happen. It doesn't just happen in a truncated way. Doesn't happen in a distorted way. Truncated like in the experience of the United States, which is very rapidly not becoming the United States at all, but some little truncated, wimpy version of it. Or some distortion like Nazi Germany or Stalinist Russia. All of these kinds of historical failures are dwarfed by the actuality where history no longer operates, no longer happens at all, that process no longer is there. Where does it go? It's already been engaged, so where does it go? It goes subconscious. And to the extent that it goes subconscious, what comes back into play are the old mythic horizons again. One has not only the same heroes, but the same gods come back. The same goddesses come back. And you think we're going to get away from towing these kinds of terrifying lines that are drawn around lives because you're not going after the isms. The gods and goddesses draw the same lines. The heroes require us to participate with dragons. And so the whole mythological bag, which was never sufficient back then, that's why human beings grew out of that. Why did they grow out of that 5,000 years ago? They're not satisfied to stay there. They want to get away from that. These constraints, these mythic constraints of the dramas that the gods and goddesses put us through, the little hoops that we have to jump through, are well known. They're even indexed. There's a scholar named Stith Thompson who produced 6 volumes of indexes of folk motif types. And that while there are a lot of them, there's a limited set of them that work again and again. And they're so well ingrained in the invisible bones of the psychic experience that the body now just cringes. And to think that some kind of Star Wars mythology is going to be sufficient for any kind of a future population is a fool's game. It's deeply flawed. Just like Joseph Campbell's insight into mythology as something that someone would live, personal mythology. There's no such thing as a personal mythology. It's a non sequitur. It not only never happens, it never can happen. Because the person, the personal, is an inverse of that ritual comportment, objectivity, that is the whole foundation, it's the bottom floor of the mythic structure. And to the extent that you are personable, that ritual comportment goes out of play. It's a complete scrambling to say that one is going to have myths to live by as some kind of developed person. It's pernicious. It's a mistake that Campbell's teacher, Heinrich Zimmer, never made. So if you want to write a new trilogy, you have to at least go back 2,400 years to someone like Aeschylus and learn what not to do. Already, Aeschylus is full of the tragic insight of human beings who are forced to live out the dramas which the gods enforce by their mythic script. They say, you want to act in our theater? Here's the script. Read it. They don't ask your permission. They don't ask for your revisions. They don't ask for your version. They compel your obedience. The Babylonians were very, very precise in their observations of gestalts, and in their mythology, they saw that the gods put man last. After the entire structure of the gods was all taken care of, all the gods and goddesses are taken care of, the sub-gods and sub-goddesses, when that structure is finished, the little tears of blood that come out of it are where man lives. So that these Babylonian dead ends, which show themselves in a very peculiar kind of a structure called a ziggurat. A ziggurat is a one-way path that goes only to one point at the top, but nothing happens except the chief man, the emperor is there, the king. And everybody else is on that path, which winds itself around and only leads to that king, that divine king. Doesn't go anywhere else. The very first transformation of that is to put the plateaued phases, like the step pyramid, in place so that the ziggurat is transformed. And from the step pyramid at Saqqara, it just took about one generation to get the reality of a symbolic form that frees vision. It's just unfortunate that that vision was freed for only a very limited number of people, an elite. But the whole purpose of that vision was to reconstellate their person after death. That's what it's all about. That one survives the death threshold and comes back into life, comes back into play. And it's not just a physiological death, but it's that threshold that happens because when the person comes into play, to the extent that the person comes into play, the ritual existence that was there naturally goes out of play. And so the rebirth is not simply a rebirth after your personal death, but it's life again, a rebirth after the death of the existence constraint that ends itself, that goes into the netherworld of the subconscious. And as it goes into the netherworld of the subconscious, what comes out of the netherworld is the person reborn. Kephren, the rising scarab, holds the son of Ra, and you rise with it. That the person lives again to the extent that they're able to let their natural existence limitations just go subconscious. And one consciously then is who you are. And you are then the protagonist who is ready to enter the new day. And what is the new day? The new day is the beginning of history. Each new day is the beginning of history. Instead of the old gods and goddesses, one then has a vision that there's perhaps such a thing as a Lord of history. That has something to do with one's person. It has nothing to do with ritual comportment. It has nothing to do with burning candles, with queuing up periodically at locales to get a fix of comfort, but has everything to do with accepting the possibilities of scintillating openness in a realm of the real, and that one is able to navigate and be viable, not only for oneself, but one's companions, one's family, mankind as a whole even. This is a very ancient and time-honored realization, and something which was in play already 5,000 years ago. It's nothing new. What's new for us is that in order for us not to devolve, we have to go forward. We have to evolve. We have to take the next steps. But we can't take the next steps, it's a universal law, until we've already taken all the steps up to this point. You can't make the next step that's really there for us, the next step for men and women 4,000 years ago. And just to take the step that they took today doesn't mean that you're ready for the real. Just means that you got caught up to 4,000 years ago. There's a lot of steps. And those steps have this quality where one needs to fill up to the point of fullness. The pleroma. What is the pleroma? The fullness of the present reality. So that next step, that next resonance is taken for real and not just in simulation, not just in catch-up. When this particular part of the education becomes understandable to you, it'll become understandable in such a way that there's no image for it. There's no image whatsoever that's sufficient for it. It's like the use of an idea. When the idea is put into use, it's not a catalog of the images. It's not just a number of token clay things that then you put out on the table and you count, and on that basis you navigate. But the opening up of a symbolic idea to the differential visionary consciousness has its own evocative quality, and what it evokes is that prism of the person that comes in art. And we'll see in just a few short weeks that there is a radical difference between someone who is a character in some traditional drama from the artist who's writing his or her play, writing his or her drama. The dramatist is quite different from someone, they call them, in the theater, they used to call them spear carriers. Somebody who's on the sidelines of the production, just carrying a spear, standing on the sidelines. Whereas in your own life, whatever that is, whatever dimensions it is, if you're a spear carrier, even the best spear carrier, it's a failure. It's not operative realistically. It's devolutionarily assigned to you. And the way those things work is there are plenty of corporate structures that have taken all the options available on those particular vignettes. They're all owned already. And they portion them out very nicely to you. Welcome back. Here's your number. THX 1146. Go here and do that. And everything will be fine. We'll call you if there's something we would like you to do. It's not everybody that can get into a racing car and find their way out. One thinks of not only THX, but of Godard's Alphaville, where the detective Lemmy finds his way into the big city of the machine and finds the girl that he wants and manages to get her out of town, even though the town is this enormous super city. And the computer, low, watery voice is all the time telling him that everything is all right, as long as he realizes that he's got to join this situation that's being taken care of. They have it all planned. The trouble is that we are not plannable. We have open possibilities when we're conscious, and the only plan that would work is no plan. No plan at all. This quality comes through when, and I'll read here from Vision as Consciousness. Nature constitutes a first world, culture a second world, with ritual and myth. And the self on a symbolic horizon is a third world. The person will be a fourth world. Yet the objectivity would be skewered here, since nature as a transformational medium is not a stability. Its world is really stable only in what we could call, and what we have called, the spirit. Spirit is the stability in the natural world order. But to know this, that takes real science. Let's come to an interesting quotation here. This is from the book Shakespeare, the Theater, and the World. The chapter is The Body of the Sign, and the author writes here that when one is putting on a drama, you have the play, you have the theater, but you also need the audience. Yet to include an audience within the larger festival boundaries of the plays. Notice the festival boundaries of the plays. Not just the boundaries of the plays, but the plays are happening within a festival cycle that also has what the French sociological language calls liminality. Not just limits, but the limits are like thresholds that as you approach them, they affect you. Liminality. Yet to include an audience within the larger festival boundaries of the plays, though a necessary strategy for understanding them, still falls short of investigating the overall situation with sufficient complexity and differential energy. This is just a little commentary on Shakespeare. In other words, there are already plenty of men and women who are considering their lives and their world in very mature ways, and we're just trying to school ourselves to get up to speed. A modern reader outside those boundaries still has no very precise way to get at what goes on inside them. Why? Because we're abstracted from and not yet privy to. So we're alienated. We're not only alienated from that mythic horizon where it would be just natural for us, but we're not yet even participatory in that artistic horizon where we would have some other stability. And so we're caught in a limbo. So that alienation is not just orphaned from something, but it's in limbo between two somethings. It's a damned if you do, damned if you don't. No wonder the anxiety is so asymptotic. You should feel anxious. Your body should cringe, your mind should object, and your whole feeling tone should be in a muddle. If you aren't in that condition, you're not being realistic when alienated. A modern reader outside those boundaries still has no very precise way to get at what goes on inside them, being reduced to gestures toward the unexplained attractions of a devotion that we do not share. But this is not only the old problem about poetry and belief. Belief is a mythic, poetry an artistic valuation. It reflects the fact that on our account, so far, the relation between drama and doctrine is still too effortless. It's effortless because one is abstract about it, is considering it in abstract, because it's really a struggle. It's a life or death struggle, is what it is. Skipping over. To propose an exit from this continuing impasse, which I trust is real and not just the artifact of a modern ideology that finds difference and contradiction in all things, I want to examine a work in which doctrine and drama are identified to such a point that the play at first seems baldly discursive, everything one always feared moralities would be, a sermon whose only claim to drama lies in its being staged, and whose staging only is the only devotion that one should sit still for. And then he goes on to talk about a certain play that he's going to consider in this way. It's this kind of an impasse, this kind of a limbo, this kind of anxiety that, like concentric contextualization, centers around a mind that does not fully begin to balance out the differential with the integral. A mind that doesn't balance differential and integral processes soon gets out of balance. And there are three different ways to go out of balance. One is to devolve and go back and just clutch at the integration, which means going back to the ritual. The other is to clutch and grab at a premature differentiation, hoping to be the person that you want to be, but without working towards being that person. And the third is to remain abstracted, because the mind also is objective. So one is caught between the ritual body, which one can go back to, but it's already destroyed by anxiety, or by hoping that you can leapfrog over the effort and get to the objective person, which is not there yet, and that's why you can't get to. Or you get caught in the neutral limbo of the mind, which becomes more and more abstracted when one tries to just focus on itself. One of the qualities of meditation is to show you that the mind, when it focuses on itself, becomes abstract to the point of vanishing. And one just doesn't notice that because you don't follow the yoga all the way through. If one follows contemplation, if one follows prayer, if one follows meditation all the way through, what is the ancient word for meditation? It's actually dhyana, means concentration, concentric packing. So the concentricities become more and more centered till they reach the center point. And when they reach the center point, they continue to contract. And one comes to what is called a singularity. That was the mathematical description that Stephen Hawking and Roger Penrose used for a black hole, a singularity. Concentration carried through to its abstract ultimate is a singularity. The black hole within the mind. But peculiar that that black hole is only a vanishing of what can vanish. The only thing that vanishes is Maya. And it vanishes because it can vanish. But what doesn't vanish, that which is real. Because it's not subject to your concentration. It's not subject to your compacting. It is what it is. Continues to be. As D.T. Suzuki wrote once, at the age of 20 years of age, he said after his first experience of enlightenment, he came out of the little zendo, and he was surprised to see that all the trees were transparent. And he looked down at himself and he says he was shocked to find that he was transparent too. And then his teacher, Shoyen Shaku, said, "Now you can go to America." Because there's no way they can ruin you. Because you're beyond that malleable, manipulable, ritual level, and you pass through the abstract danger of the mind just being stable in its own need to be secure within itself. Now your maturity is assured because you won't stop until you become who you are. There's no way to stop you because there's no other place for you to be. You're never going to be in a body that will live only so many decades more. You really don't need that body permanently. You won't be in a mind that has, at its best, the capacity to center itself out of existence. But you will have the freedom and the possibility to become the person who you are, who is eternal, an eternal form. Because it occurs in a differential, opening way. It doesn't depend upon thusness to be. Its expressiveness, instead, the Sanskrit terms are best here because they're the most precise. The term for thusness in Sanskrit is tathata. Tathata. The Buddha was a tathagata, someone who had gone beyond existence. Well, what's beyond existence? What's beyond tathata? Shunyata. Openness. Openness itself, which surprisingly has forms all of its own. The person is a form of openness. And what the person does is prism the spectrum of possibility. Against what? Against the objectivity of the cosmos. What did God tell Moses to say? Who sent you? I will be what I will be. That's who sent you. Tell him. you're told.